Just going to turn another light on. Better the focus is now that I've got more light.
You're more
something
crisp.
I hadn't realized. Yeah, well, I'm always crisp, you know.
Okay, that's the dog's crispy critter. Hamilton Wendy, welcome. Thank you to Life. Welcome. Well, I can't speak English. Oh my word. Welcome to Life in a Garden Online. It's fantastic to have you here this evening, joining us. And we're going to talk about you, actually. The focus is more about you than your book, but we will get to the book as well. Hamilton, who are you?
Well, I'm somebody who got caught and punished for reading Jane Austen in double maths class. I actually hid Jane Austen. Jane Austen was my set book for English. And I had Drea, which was our maths textbook, and I did okay at maths. I worked quite hard at it. But I was so entranced with Jane Austen that I read it in double maths. So that's me. I'm a words person. I'm a storyteller. I'm a respecter and lover of storytellers. And I really, you know, that's been my passion ever since I can actually really remember.
When are we talking about? That you were reading
so I
Jane
was
Austen?
15 years old.
That's not very boyish.
No, but you know what? That's fine. That's cool. I mean, I think that one of the things I like about the world we live in today is that it's not very boyish, or, you know, it's much more open, much more equal, much more shared. I mean, I was absolutely, and I say this with pride, I was absolutely entranced by the opening sentence of Pride and Prejudice, which is a truth universe. Which it is a truth universally acknowledged that a man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. Now, I remember that from double maths class, you know, when I was 15 years old. And I mean, you know, of course, growing up, we weren't that aware of feminist issues and male gender issues and all of these kind of things. But I was absolutely, and I'm proud to say it, I've never actually thought of it this closely before. I was entranced by Jane Austen and Jane Austen's irony and wit and humor from the age of 15.
Did you play rugby at all? So just checking.
Yeah, I did. We did win the House Cup. We did win the House Cup, but I never got anything beyond, I think, the 6th team or something, you know, in rugby. I was a hooker and I was a scrum half, and I once broke away in the House Cup and took the ball and ran and scored a goal, a try right underneath the goalposts. So I quite enjoyed rugby. I've actually got my rugby picture somewhere on my wall. We were the Bontebokke, and we were the kind of has-beens who weren't really in the main rugby team, but we did win the cup, and our captain bought us all a bottle of Fanta or something.
I'd like to know what that photo is. We're coming back to this. Above your left shoulder.
Which one?
Your left shoulder.
This one here?
No, up. Go up.
Oh, this one?
Yeah.
Okay, well, these photographs are all of my wife.
I thought there was military or something.
Yeah, so this is a different photograph. This is a photograph that one of the press photographers at the time took, and they used to take great, I mean, it was fantastic. They were working for the Star, the Rand Daily Mail or something like that. And they would send us, they would take our address and they would send us print, you know, large format printouts. They wouldn't WhatsApp us a picture. It was a really nice thing. So this was Operation Thunder Chariot, I think it was, in 1984 or 85.
Angola?
Lehotla. I did go to Angola then. So this was P.W. Botha ran this operation to show the extraordinary power of the South African military. And this was probably one of my first really quote unquote war correspondent jobs I did. So it's interesting that you've picked it up.
Which one are you?
I haven't framed it. I am, let me just see. I am this guy over here in the white shirt with I was a big rower at school with a rowing team cap on. And that's Francois Marais next to me, who was the BBC cameraman. And that's the ZDF cameraman, I can't remember his name, and the ZDF soundman. And kneeling there, actually quite humbly, was Michael Burke, who was the 9 o'clock news presenter for many, many years on the BBC. So it's interesting that you picked that up. That was probably my very first war correspondent experience.
Okay, so what made you, okay, firstly, so you matriculated and then went into the army, I presume, or you?
No, I didn't go to the army. I went straight into university. And I started studying building science, which is a combination of a BCom and civil engineering. And, you know, I was a conscientious kid. I wasn't the smartest kid in the class, but I passed everything, you know, with the reasonable averages. So I could kind of do anything except, even in those days, medicine, you know. And I never really thought of doing medicine. So I did engineering. And I passed everything in the first year. And then the second year, I really realized, you know what, this is, you know, go back to Jane Austen. And so I kind of spent that whole year rowing and being on the committee of the rowing club and doing very well in rowing, breaking some South African records, which was fantastic. You know, I wasn't in the first team rowing, but I was in the second team, and we still had our little, we were the senior B8. And then I studied a bachelor's degree at Wits. And I must say there was a very, very critical point where there was a demonstration at Wits. And I don't remember the details of it, but Roy Rus Swanepoel, who was an incredibly cruel police colonel, I think, came onto the campus. And I remember them whipping the students, particularly the young girl students, with their shamboks. And in those days, the girls were wearing very thin Indian print dresses that, you know, you could almost see their underwear underneath. So there was no kind of protection.
Yeah.
They were cruelly whipping them. And I remember then the kind of left-wing element of the student body started shouting absurd. I didn't agree with what the police were doing at all, but the kind of absurdity of the left-wing views. And I thought, you know, I need to make my own decisions. And it was a kind of seminal moment for me that I didn't consciously then become a journalist, but I decided I would never be a political activist. And I mean, there are some worthwhile political activists. Let's not deny that. But I, at that moment, joined the fraternity of people across the globe. And I didn't think of it then. That wasn't I was 19 or something, perhaps even 18. I didn't think of it in such clear terms, but whose real mission is now, as I see it, as a 50-something adult, to, you know, hold power to account, whether it's left-wing power or right-wing power or even moderate power. And so that was a seminal moment that I would never have been able to express it in such clear diction as I can do now, you know. But I decided then and there that I was going to choose my own path. And I sort of wanted to get into the film industry, and I studied English and drama and film. There was no journalism at Wits at that point. And I wasn't actually that interested in journalism at that point. But there was a kind of, I don't know, power of the universe that drew me into witnessing history and getting a front row seat at history, or even a kind of, not, because you're not a sitting participant in journalism, you actively have a front row walking seat at the demonstrations of history. And, you know, I've still kept that very creative side. I've written children's books, I've written novels, but there's a time when I'm a journalist and I'm really double checking every fact and checking sources. And there's another time when I'm writing children's fantasy books. And so keeping those parts of my psyche alive are important to me.
It's very different writing a book about a war and writing a children's book. How do you marry the two in your head?
Well, I think I keep them separate to some degree. You know, again, a lot of these decisions, and I think we can all say that for ourselves. A lot of these decisions are not conscious. I know exactly what I'm going to do now, and that's going to define my future, and I'm sure of it, you know. I knew that I was not going to stop reading fiction while I was working as a journalist. So, for example, when I covered the Iraq War in 2003, I took the big, thick double version, Penguin version of War and Peace, which was just an overwhelmingly wonderful experience to read that book at the same time as being involved in this kind of very dodgy war, which I never agreed with, but at the same time to see the human aspects of the soldiers involved in the war, because we mostly saw soldiers, but not entirely. I was fortunate enough to film some Iraqi civilians. I wasn't embedded in that war. When I was in Afghanistan in 2012 with the US Marines, I read the Lebanese Snicket trilogy. You know, so I've consciously kept that alive.
Have you read Crime and Punishment?
I have. I read it a long time ago. I actually was quite moved by it. I just recently read Dostoevsky, The Demons, during the winter of last lockdown, or The Devils, or The Possessed, whatever the correct translation of it. My Russian is quite poor. You know, it was hard work, but it gave me an insight
into the Russian psyche.
Well, into part of the Russian psyche. I mean, let's not decide what the Russian psyche is. Let the Russians decide that for themselves. You know what I'm saying? But certainly into, I mean, I don't think Dostoevsky was the most stable character. You know, if you look at his gambling and his womanizing and his kind of desperate situation that he always got himself into, you know, I doubt whether he can be said to speak entirely for the kind of people who support Navalny and who put their lives on the line for democratic reforms in Russia, you know. And actually, interestingly, Dostoevsky was an important influence. Dostoevsky's life, the little bit that I know about it, was an important and remains an important influence for me, because one of the things I promised myself is I'll never go down that road as a creative writer into kind of chaotic madness. I will always keep a balanced kind of world where I earn reasonable money as a journalist. I, you know, work as a corporate consultant. And so that, you know, I don't want that for my life. I don't want to be a gambling addict and a womanizer, you know, and that kind of thing. So that's, I spend, not every day, because some days I'm spending much more time pursuing my middle class
existence.
Kind of existence. But some days I go straight. I mean, today I've been working on my Arabella series, which I published 2 of, and I'm now working on 3, maybe 4. Into the most Jungian kind of symbolic places about birds in the garden, South African birds, that I don't really have and don't really want to try and explain in a very rational way. I'd rather just trust the Jungian subconscious.
Hamilton, so you don't study journalism, but you kind of move laterally into journalism. And then do you suddenly wake up and think, shit, I actually want to be a war correspondent? What is that? What is it that takes you to a war?
Well, in South Africa in the 1980s, you had to be a war correspondent. You would immediately, I mean, my first story, I started working for the BBC because I met some people at a party, and it turned out that 2 of them, their stepfather was the BBC cameraman, and he met a guy who was studying drama and film. So I was studying Aeschylus and Euripides and John Ford, which was just incredible. Drama and film at Wits still made me the writer and the creative person and filmmaker that I am today. And I must give credit to the university for that. And, you know, my very first story was to go to Everton in the Vaal, what was then called the Vaal Triangle. And I think there were, it was a township, sure. I don't remember how many people were shot dead the week before, but there was a funeral, and then the police came over the hill in their Caspers, and the people just roared with rage and started throwing rocks and bricks, and the police shot back, and boom, I was in the middle of it. And I can actually still feel a little bit of tension and stress as I talk about that. In fact, we got trapped against a fence as we were kind of trying to ease our way out. And somebody in the crowd, I don't know who it was, came out with a pair of wire cutters and cut the fence, and we could drive through the velds and get back onto the R59 or whatever the road was, I don't know. So being a war correspondent in South Africa in the 1980s, the mid-1980s, was, for an ordinary journalist who wasn't a specialist in financial journalism or entertainment journalism, was kind of, I guess, unavoidable. I've never thought about it that clearly. And then I saw 7 people shot dead in front of me in Crossroads in February 1985. Don't remember the exact date, but I remember it very clearly. And the police dragging these bodies that looked like, the bodies looked like sacks of grain or something like that, and throwing them in the back of the Casbah. And then we filmed it for the BBC. And I don't remember the exact details, but one of the apartheid ministers, I think it was Pit Botha, said something about one person has been killed in crossfire in Crossroads. And we on the BBC 9 o'clock news had the film of 7 bodies. And the story's on, you can find the story on the internet on the front page of the New York Times, written by the then correspondent Alan Cowell. And I then knew, again, not consciously, but not that it would be such an important thread through my life, that we had held truth to power. The apartheid regime couldn't deny, and we weren't even activists, and we weren't politicians, and we weren't trying to be activists. We were certainly trying to be humanists, but we showed that 7 people had been killed that late afternoon. The sun was just setting as they were killed. And we got it on the 9 o'clock news in London. So that was a transformative experience.
Okay,
yeah.
No, carry on.
No, it's one of the reasons why I don't suffer from, I think that I don't suffer from debilitating post-traumatic stress.
That was one of my next questions.
Duck down. If I hear something, I'm going to duck down. That's almost a natural reaction. Like if a bird flies over your head, you're going to duck, I believe very strongly in the value of bearing witness. I've been very fortunate that I've never been in an army. I chose not to serve in the apartheid army. I've never killed anybody. I've never been asked to kill anybody. I've never been in a situation where I didn't believe in something and still had to pull a trigger. So, I have immense respect for war veterans who've had those choices. I didn't have those choices. So, I've witnessed them at first hand in a very, very brutal and visceral way for a long time. I mean, the most recent was in January in Uganda, where some soldiers were outside, whatever that opposition activist, his name escapes me for a moment, Bobby Wine, outside Bobby Wine's house. And actually they weren't particularly aggressive, but some of the young journalists panicked, and there were some camouflage men with AK-47s, and we all started running, and my heart got pounding a bit. But I believe deeply, deeply in the value of bearing witness. And again, it's highly important that we do bear witness. We never are the absolute arbiters of truth and righteousness. Sometimes we get it right. And if you know Martha Gellhorn?
No.
Okay, she was a journalist in her own rights, but her real kind of claim to fame in the common world is that she was married briefly to Ernest Hemingway. But Martha Gellhorn wrote some amazing stuff. And she's always inspired me. She wrote a book called The Face of War. And I strongly urge you and your listeners to order the book. It's the most extraordinary book. And particularly the 1950, The Face of War, I can see you writing, Mariana, by Martha Gellhorn. And I'm paraphrasing, but she wrote in the preface to the 1959 edition. So it's been in print for a long time. I think the latest print is Granta Press. And she said, you know, when I was young and impressionable, and again, I'm paraphrasing, I thought that if I could only show the truth, then the angels would come to act. And now that I've seen 5 wars and a revolution, she went through the Spanish Civil War, she went through the Second World War, she went through various revolutions in South America. She said, I no longer believe in the saving actions. She's perhaps more cynical than I am, because I kind of do believe in the Zondo Commission, for example.
Sorry.
And she said, I no longer believe in the saving action, but I do believe that the act of keeping the record straight is an honorable act. And that has stuck with me. The act of at least trying to keep the record straight is an honorable act. And that, to go back to my own personal psychology, is something I'm thinking of Angola as I talk, and the war that I covered there. I covered it in the 80s briefly, in the kind of within the ambit of the SADF and UNITA. That was a very limited view of the war, but it was still, you know, part of the experience. And then in 93, we had absolute freedom to travel almost anywhere we wanted with the MPLA. You know, by that stage, America and South Africa had switched sides. They were supporting the MPLA, not UNITA, and it was still the SADF in 93. And, you know, we went constantly. We were up at 4 a.m, getting on United Nations helicopters. It's not so easy to do anymore. You know, I need all sorts of paperwork to sign the insurance forms and that kind of thing, you know.
Yeah.
But in those days, if you pitched up at the airport at 4 o'clock in the morning, or 5 o'clock in the morning, they'd put you on a chopper and they'd say, okay, we'll be back at 3. That's when the chopper leaves. And we could film just about whatever we could do. And we somehow kept the record straight, at least in a limited way.
So after,
and so that, to me, yeah.
So after Angola?
Well, I did Mozambique in 92. And of course, this was ongoing at the backdrop of the terrible violence that was going on in our own country.
Yeah. Necklacings.
You know, necklacings, military action by the police, by the army. So that, you know, we as South Africans, particularly South African journalists, I mean, the Bang Bang Club, you know, all of us television crews were there, while the stills photographers were there as well, you know, and Joao and Greg Marinovich have written a wonderful book. And it really is a wonderful book. And they're 2 people I've worked with closely and admire amazingly. But remember, there were sometimes 8 or 10 television crews alongside, you know, the stills photographers. And, you know, we as the crews, it's the guy or the woman who stands in front of the camera, and that's the way the medium is, who gets the credit as the brave reporter. But very often, you know, it's the nature of the medium. Very often they are back in the office, pulling in feeds from Reuters or AP, Associated Press, and you're out there getting the pictures. So against that backdrop, we covered Angola, we covered Mozambique. Then we began in just literally days after Madiba's election as president. I was asked to go to Rwanda to cover the genocide in Rwanda, which I covered and I've written about, and I'm very proud of what I've written about. And Mariana, I can see you writing. You can look on Amazon. There's a book called True North, African Roads Less Traveled. You can find my profile on Amazon. And I'm in touch to this day with a woman called Beata, who was a young child during the genocide. And it's a very complicated story. But basically, I was on an aid convoy that was evacuating her and a group of about 200 orphans, or at least children, maybe children whose parents had gone missing, to Burundi. And one of the reasons the Interahamwe, the Hutu extremist militia, did not attack them is because there were white journalists on the convoy with them. So I don't want to get into a white savior narrative, but we clearly were standing out as somebody different. We were working for the BBC, and we are now, we speak on Skype every now and then. We're quite in touch on Instagram, and she's beginning to write about that experience. And I'm beginning to be part of that experience that she had that I couldn't have had because I wasn't in her position. But it resonates now, what's it, 30 years later? It still resonates through my life. And I can get quite emotional talking about the Rwandan genocide, but I don't have a breakdown. You know, I believe what I did was very important and very worthwhile. And I was part of a BBC crew. And I believe what all of us did was very important and very worthwhile.
And so from Rwanda, we went to, I'm like tracking these war stories and thinking,
Yeah.
not
Well,
something
the next
I would like
thing,
to
of
do.
course, was Eastern Congo, which was then Eastern Zaire, and the fall of Mobutu in 1997, with various trips here and there back to Angola, you know. But the fall of Mobutu was a huge thing. I mean, hardly anyone remembers who Mobutu Sese Seko was anymore, you know. But we were in Kinshasa for about 6 weeks, and I kept a journal. I kept a little diary. I kept a little wire-bound notebook in my pocket, and I would even write down the time, and I would start a new day with a date, and I would start writing down the time of when things happened, and then cross-reference it later with news reports, either that I had worked on with the BBC or that I read in newspapers. And I wrote about that in a book called Deadlines from the Edge, which is also about the invasion of Afghanistan in 2001. So that was 97, was Mobutu. Then, 98 was the first almost Kuwait-Iraq war again. 99, I don't remember particularly well, but I'm sure I would have gone to Burundi or somewhere like that. 2000, again, and I don't really remember, but I'm sure 2000 was Nigeria, the transition to democracy in Nigeria, the fighting in the Niger Delta. Barbara, I didn't ever interview Idi Amin. Thank you for your question. And then, of course, 9/11 happened in 2001, and we were actually covering the civil war in Burundi. And we had come back to Nairobi to edit, and we were locked in an edit suite, and I didn't see the first tower go down. And one of the BBC journalists came into the edit suite and said, you know, do you know what's happening? And we went,
the world's changing.
The world's changing. And then weeks later, I was in Tajikistan, in Central Asia. And then from there, I was on the last helicopter into northern Afghanistan with the Northern Alliance. And then that was pretty amazing. That's what led to my book, House of War, because at one of the points that the Northern Alliance took us to was an ancient city that had been founded by one of the Alexander the Great's generals, and you could still see the outlines of the Greek Acropolis. And I didn't see them, but I know that from research that the old Greek theater still exists in that ancient city. It's hardly a city by today's standards, called Ai-Khanum, which is called Alexandria on the Oxus in Greek, whatever it is in Greek. I don't speak Greek. And sure, 2002, we were the first crew into southern Angola, into Savimbi's territory, after he'd been taken out by the Israeli Special Forces. Well, the Israeli Special Forces found him, and the MPLA Special Forces actually took him out. The Israelis tracked his sat phone. And
what does your wife think of this?
Well, she's actually very supportive. It's what I do. I don't do it as much as I used to. It gives me an incredible view of the history of the world that I'm living in. And, you know, I'm really not a war junkie. I've been to wars partly because I've been thrown into the situation, partly because people have respected my expertise as a journalist and have asked me to do it. And I've weighed up the pros and cons. In 2012 was my last real, well, not last, but very, very big thing. I did a 5-part series for National Geographic on the US Marines, and we were in Helmand Province. And there was one time where we walked for 15 days through Helmand Province with the US Marines being shot at. There were 1 or 2 days where they didn't bother us, but mostly we were shot at least 3 times a day. Thank God I never saw.
Where's the Helmand Province?
Helmand Province is right south on the Iranian border. It's called the Desert of Death in Dari, which is not Dari, Pashtun. Dari is in the north. It's a very, very difficult environment. I mean, yeah.
Is that the backdrop to Red Air?
That's the backdrop to Red Air. You know, I didn't write anything nonfiction about that experience, partly because I was shooting it for National Geographic, and National Geographic owns the right to the nonfiction. So I decided to take my experiences and kind of look at human beings in war, particularly men. And, you know, nowadays the battlefield is changing. There are more and more young women who are leading patrols as second lieutenants and so forth. But, and what I wanted it to be, Red Air is my latest book. And I really wanted it to be a non-political look at how people go into combat and how they face that deep paradox of anger and fear. And possibly it's a triple paradox, joy as well, that is battle. Because it's terribly frightening to be shot at, and it makes you terribly, terribly angry. It doesn't matter what your political beliefs are. This is, if you're in combat, that's what happens to you. You can't be a pacifist on the front line, you know. And there's a kind of joy, which certainly people like as far back as Homer have written about, when you defeat your enemy. So I wanted to try, and I found that fiction and the use of symbol and metaphor rather than explicit psychological terminology were more useful to me as my kind of writer. I'm not a psychologist. Using symbol and metaphor to examine, examine sounds like too fancy a word really, but to express what it's like to be shot at 3 times a day for 15 days. Thank God we didn't see too much real close-up fighting, but people were killed. And one of the US Marines, not somebody I knew, I discovered later, had committed suicide from battlefield stress.
I think there's a lot of that.
Yeah, it makes you irrational. It's terrifying.
In fact, there's a Daily
What
Maverick.
do you do?
There's a Daily Maverick article today on suicide and how it's affecting the men mostly. It's very much at the moment, predominantly male, massive suicide rate.
Well, look, I mean, that's a slightly different issue, but I think that men are programmed to be strong and be protective and all of that kind of thing. That's slightly different in war, because although you've got to be strong, and you do have to remain strong, and the Marine Corps, which I'm proud to have, or glad to have, because I'm not a Marine, I didn't serve with the Marine Corps, that would be wrong to say, but I spent some very close, intense time with Marines in full frontal battle. There is an ethos and the Marine Corps is older than the United States. It's 1 year older than the United States. And so there's an ethos there that if you're going to go into those situations, you need to be trained and psychologically prepared to do that. And I was just, hey, man, a liberal journalist going in with the Marines, I'm not a Marine, But I respected so much of what they did and the way they kept their discipline. And it has to be said, the same thing can be said for the Taliban. And a lot of the Marines really respected the Taliban, not their ideals, but respected them as people who competence, and respected their discipline and their commitment. But believe me, I'm not promoting the Taliban, but let's look at human beings. And that was very important to me in Red Air, was to include the Afghan suffering as well.
So Danny,
the idea that
sorry, I'm going to ask you a question.
Danny, yeah.
So, would you say that you are Danny? Because Danny is the son of the CIA operative that has been taken captive by the Afghanis, correct?
Yeah, look, I'm not Danny. No fictional character is ever what the author, or very seldom. But I'm certainly Danny. Part of Danny is me. For me, what I did, Danny is one of the main characters who's a journalist, for those of you who haven't read the book. I realized that I needed to take the reader with me into this special world, which is what a lot of Hollywood writers talk about. E.T. takes you into the special world of E.T. In Red Air, I'm taking you into the special world of the Marines in Afghanistan. I don't know everything about Marine training. I don't know everything about Camp Pendleton or Paris Island. I don't know that. It's not, but what Danny could do was take himself and his liberal preconceptions and sometimes biases into a world where people were doing something that they had to do. And you could put aside being a Democrat or Republican or whatever. As a Marine, you're a Marine. And I wanted to get into that psychological truth as much as I could. And as I said earlier, I'm not a psychologist. So I couldn't write a psychological treatise about it, but I could certainly express it in image and metaphor.
So whilst it's a book about war, it's actually a very human story about human interactions and human interchanges and what humans are going through as opposed to soldiers.
Absolutely. And that's really what I wanted to achieve. And I think that from some of the feedback I've gotten as the book has become public, it's achieved that. It is really not a kind of yay, Marine Corps, but it's not also, hey, I'm a pacifist, I hate the Marine Corps, and I hate the Taliban. It's much more about how people adjust to this deep, ancient truth of our existence, is that we do go to war. I wish we didn't. Thank God I've not seen the worst of war, although perhaps at the Rwandan genocide, I think I could say I've seen the worst of war.
Yeah, I think that's pretty graphic.
Stretch. Yeah, no, by a very long stretch. And sometimes war is necessary in order to stop evil. It's a truism that we had to stop Hitler, it doesn't even bear debate,
Isn't war also necessary for population control and stuff like that? Because we haven't had a major world global event war for many years, and our population is out of control.
Yeah, I don't know about that really. I couldn't comment on that. To me, honestly, I don't know about that.
Hamilton, in related to this book, what about ISIS being on our doorstep in Mozambique? Is that not a very scary?
It's very scary. It's also much more, it has not been reported on enough. It's very difficult to report on. I've actually been involved peripherally on reporting on Mozambique. I've been to Mozambique many times, but on this particular issue in Cabo Delgado, I haven't been there. It's not that simple. And I'm really not an expert on it, but there are factions within Frelimo and Renamo that are left over from the old civil war days who are involved. It's not a simple ISIS kind of offshoot. It's a complex kind of mix of people who've been left out of the Mozambican economy. There's this massive oil and gas finds, which are again alienating very poor people. What is Zimbabwe doing about it? What is Tanzania doing about it? What is South Africa going to do about it? There's no kind of central thought from SADC on how to deal with this issue. A lot of the people are crossing over from Tanzania. It's monstrously complicated. And it's very complicated in Syria too, which I know very little about, so I would rather not comment. But it's not a simple idea that, like when the Taliban took over Afghanistan, they kicked all the girls out of school, and now there are crazy people in Afghanistan who are killing. Just 2 days ago, 3 women who were journalists were shot to death. You know, the one thing that America and the NATO coalition have done in Afghanistan is put girls back in school. Millions of girls are back in school in Afghanistan. Whether that's happening in northern Mozambique, I don't really know. It's very, very complicated, and it is scary.
Please, would you give, I mean, we've been talking around the subject, but we haven't actually dived right into your book. Won't you give everybody a little synopsis, a brief synopsis of what the story is?
Okay, well, basically Red Air is about a journalist called Danny, who's got a father who's an aging CIA agent, who is he was a Vietnam veteran. He's given his life to serving the American cause in whichever foreign theater of war or conflict that he has been involved in. And Danny rejects his father. He's a pacifist, he's a liberal, he doesn't respect what his father did in the Marine Corps, he doesn't respect what his father did in the CIA. And then Danny goes to Afghanistan, but subconsciously he's following in his father's footsteps as a war correspondent, you see. And he goes to Afghanistan and he reports on a splinter group, of which there are many in Afghanistan, and this is a fictional splinter group. And he inadvertently reveals the hotel where he interviews the son of the militant who runs a splinter group. And that means that the Afghan government is able to capture, I wouldn't say kidnap, capture the son. And so the head of the militant group, Azmarai Shah, decides, okay, he's going to get his own back. He's going to use the international web. He's going to use Facebook. He's going to use Twitter. And he's going to call out Danny and say, we've captured your father who's in Afghanistan. So then the Marine Corps, of course, is incredibly loyal. So they go to rescue one of their own, which they ordered to do. They have to do that as a military necessity. But they take Danny along with them because Azmarai Shah, the warlord, says, bring your famous journalist son so that we can use his stories to promote our cause. And then Danny enters into the world of war, and he enters into the world of his father, and he begins to question his own rejection of his father. And he then begins to learn about the reality of war and the reality of soldiers in war and what they face. And I won't go into the rest of the story, but that's kind of where it takes you.
Do you have a favorite part that you'd actually like to read an excerpt from?
Sure, I haven't really prepared one, I'm afraid to say.
No, we don't. We like to spring these things on you. We don't really like prepared reading.
Well, I do have a copy of it. I don't know if I've got any. Here's the book, by the way, Red Air. You can, I think it's looking upside down to me. I don't know if you guys.
No, it's the right side up.
Right side up.
Right side up. Here's my copy, all ready to go.
Oh, good. Okay, fantastic.
Who did the cover?
Well, here's chapter. Sorry?
Who did the cover?
Who did the cover? Well, I published this independently. So an amazing publisher called Anita, and I'm just trying to remember her surname, but from Quartz Publishers. And I can highly recommend Quartz Publishers in Midrand. They've done a totally professional job. I got it professionally edited. And, it's not a self-published book. It's an independently published book. Anita Stander is her name. And she is quite extraordinary. And I hope she's listening or hears this, because she really, even just the quality of the print, the pages, the
binding,
spine, the binding, everything is incredible. So I'm still holding the pistol. So this is Danny. Now, for the first time, he's had to shoot somebody, which I've never done. So I've got to imagine this. I'm still holding the pistol as Gonzalez, who's one of the Marines, kneels down next to me and opens a field dressing, which he shoves against the bottom of my chin. I let it slip from my fingers as he opens the clasp of my helmet strap and gently works it off my head. He fastens the gauze around my head and ties it firmly. It ain't as bad as it feels. He didn't hit any veins, Gonzalez tells me. Just a flesh wound. The chin strap deflected most of the blade. Gonzalez ties the end of the field dressing. I watch the young Afghans kicking stop. So now imagine a liberal journalist having killed somebody. I mean, this is just a moment of kind of existential crisis. And the Marines are like they're both dead. Andy, who's one of the CIA guys with them, says, the captain looms over me. There's no telling who heard that shot, he says. I had to. The captain nods. We just got to move fast now.
And is that where you're stopping?
That's where I'm stopping, yeah. I think it gives you a sense that's, interestingly, that's actually a pivotal point where the Marines can't waste energy on his guilt or shame or whatever for killing. They simply got to move fast now.
Yeah, because the enemy's on the doorstep and we need to get out of here.
Yeah, and so there's this thing that happens to everybody in war, not only men, where you've got to put that stuff under. And particularly for Vietnam vets, which I'm not old enough to remember, but they came back and people never respected that incredible self-control and discipline to say, we just got to move fast now.
When I was a little girl, I always thought I would grow up to marry a Vietnam vet.
Well, they're getting a bit old for you, Mandy.
I know. I bearing in mind that growing up in South Africa, you grew up with soldiers all over the place, and I have a huge thing for men in uniform. It's never gone away.
Well, it never does it?
No. In fact, so much so that when we were in Mexico, and the Mexican police, the federales, are absolutely beautiful in their black uniforms, and they're quite striking looking. It was my friends would say, "There's another one from Andy." It was quite an eye candy feast all over, because there's no shortage of militia in Mexico.
Well, I tell you what, these young Marines, my wife certainly had her eye candy moments with them, and I made very good friends with some of the older ones. Let's face it, we're not rational beings. We have lusts, we have fears, we have rages, and that's kind of something we're touching on without even really explicitly talking about it, I mean, I mean, my respect for the Marines, particularly for the captain, who's now a lieutenant colonel, who led them, and he also had a degree in astrophysics. You can Google him, Ben Middendorf, Lieutenant Colonel Ben Middendorf. He's now the commanding officer of 3-5, which is, if you've ever seen the movie Full Metal Jacket, it's one of the most famous Marine divisions in the world. They were also in the First World War at Belleau Wood, which I didn't realize until I read over the last winter, how badly equipped the Americans were in the First World War, and how they were sent in the very last phases of the war with very bad and poor equipment. And they were told to retreat by the French at Belleau Wood. And famously, the colonel who was in charge of 3-5 said, "Retreat, hell, we just got here." And so their motto is, yes, Barbara, I missed it. Can I just see it again here?
I find it weird that after all this time, we still find the only way to win is to go to war and kill.
Barbara, what can I tell you? I wish the world were different. But it isn't. And it hasn't been, probably as far as we can tell with the Neolithic record, ever since we were, I would say, cavemen and women. What is important, and I think it's crucial, is to try and keep, as I said earlier about Martha Gellhorn, to try and keep some honorable way of war. keep some limits on it. I mean, I'm really not a war philosopher. And, you know, if we can avoid war, so much the better. One thing I have learned in a very minor situation is in terms of civil unrest, when people start throwing rocks and petrol bombs, if you've got 10 policemen, like what happened in the Capitol building in America, they didn't have enough boots on the ground. So extreme violence broke out. If you've got a lot of boots on the well-trained, disciplined boots on the ground, you're going to have a lesser chance of violence. And that's a very practical lesson. It's not a very philosophically, perhaps, palatable lesson, but it's certainly something I've learned.
Did you see old Buffalo Bill from that Capitol Hill invasion is getting his, what's the food called? Organic food in prison because he said it's his right.
Yeah, you know, I mean, really, you know, the idea that you can threaten people's lives, threaten to kill the vice president and the Speaker of the House, and then still demand organic food as if it's some kind of, that puts you in some kind of moral supremacy over having threatened people with violence, I find that despicable. It is very good, however, that the system of accountability and law and justice allows a prisoner to ask for that, whether we like the prisoner or not.
And get it, no less.
And get it, whether we like the prisoner or not, or respect the prisoner's ideals. You know, that is crucial. And having a disciplined, well-ordered military is unfortunately a reality that no society in this world, to answer your question in a fuller way, Barbara, can avoid.
You know, my
an
dad
undisciplined rowdy. Yeah.
No, you finish what you were saying.
No, an undisciplined rowdy military is much more dangerous than a disciplined military.
My dad fought in the Second World War. He was one of those gung-ho young men who at 15 or 16 forged his mother's signature on the enrollment papers and joined the Second World War from South Africa. And he said that the South African army was one of the strongest armies in the world and the most disciplined in those days, and could have won the war single-handedly, gung-ho, hoorah, whatever. What do you think of our army today? Could we go into battle and fight one?
Well, in Bangui, which was only a couple of years ago, you know, that book has just come out, the South Africans did incredibly well. And by the way, seeing as I'm speaking, I think only to women here tonight, there were two very brave women who were also incredibly honest. I don't remember the whole story. I haven't read the book. You know, Bangui is the capital of the Central African Republic, where these rebels attacked the South African peacekeepers. And they literally fought like Custer, just machine gunning rebels who came at them wave after wave after wave. And these two women took, I don't know, tens of thousands of dollars, which was part of the military funds. And they kind of put them in their combat jackets and they walked through roadblocks carrying tens of thousands of dollars. It's an incredible story. And I can't wait to read the book. Whether our army is really up to it today, I'm not a military expert. I think it's unlikely. I think that I know that there are certain specialized units in the army and the police that do a very good job. But, you know, we don't really have an army. We don't have an army that functioned like it did under apartheid or under in the Second World War. We don't. That's for sure. And in fact, And in fact, the Minister of Defense, Nosiviwe Mapiza, is it? Mapiza Ngakulo wrote a piece late last year saying, you know, we're not well funded enough.
Her husband's got,
I think it was
stage 2 colon cancer, so I don't think her head is in the game at the moment.
No, sure, but yeah. Anyway, I think I'm looking at my clock there. We're sort of out of time.
No, we're not. I have another question. I have another question for you. Don't
okay, cool.
Except that I've just forgotten it, and it was very important. Shit.
About the army, the Second World War.
It was army related. Oh, it's gone. I'll send it to you privately.
Okay, fine.
No. I know what it was. your book, Wende. I mean, I thoroughly enjoyed reading it, and I actually said that to you as soon as I finished reading it. I sent you a message, and I also said I picked you out for something, which I'm not going to say now.
Yeah. It's quite amusing. Yeah.
It's for coming from me. It's,
you know what, I had to do that. I had to do that for narrative purposes.
No, I did realize it, you know, but it's the question we always ask. I mean, like, what happened? Anyway, so Stephen McGowan, was any of his story in this kidnapping story?
No, not at all.
Nothing.
Nothing at all. There was a guy who was an American who was called Redbeard, which I used in the book, who was somewhere in Helmand province when the Marines were there. So that was based, they never found him, but they certainly, if they had found him, they would have been very angry with him. They would have arrested him and, you know, taken him to justice. But it was actually based on something that was actually happening in 2012 in Helmand province.
Okay, it's really...
it wasn't anything to do with Steve McGowan.
We're going to be talking to him soon as well, just by the way, everybody.
Well, he's read my book, I've read his book, and we've been in touch on Facebook. And yeah, his is an amazing book.
Yeah, I've just finished it, which was amazing to read. It really was. And he doesn't have the thing that I read, and I can only put it down to his embracing of Islam. There's no sense of anger in his book. I don't know if you noticed that. It's like he's not angry.
Sure.
And I think that's amazing, you know, to spend 6 years with Al-Qaeda and come back normal, so to speak. I can only put it down to having found a religion that essentially is about peace.
Yeah, look, I agree. I mean, it was very important in my book, Red Air, to also include the Afghan point of view as much as I could. So again, it's not written from an Afghan point of view. It's written from Danny and Al, the Americans' point of view, but how they interact with Afghans. Because, of course, you know, there are millions of Afghans who don't want an extremist country at all. They want their daughters to go to school, and they want their wives to go to school, and they want to have jobs, and they, you know, they want to live in as normal a country as possible.
Well, on that note, in an abnormal world, Hamilton, it's been absolutely fabulous chatting to you again. I never even got to talk to you about your other books. I've read at least 2 of the other ones, House of War and Magic Mongongonut Tree. I've read that as well.
Arabella,
Arabella. So yeah, those are fabulous. And I will stand behind this book. This is one book that I will get behind and say it's definitely worth reading. It's very human. I don't always put you don't always see me endorsing books. I mean, I'll interview the authors, but I certainly don't say, go out and read it, rah, rah, rah. But I thoroughly enjoyed it. And thank you so
very much, Mandy.
Just a note that next week we're chatting to Mike Sears about personal safety and situational awareness in the time of COVID. You might want to join us.
Okay. Well, thank you again, Mandy. Much appreciated.
Good night, bye, everyone. Have a great evening. You must read Red Air. Exactly, Janine. You must read Red Air. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.